E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā hauewha. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. On behalf of CARE at Massey University, Assalamu alaikum and warm Pacific greetings to you all. My name is Balmohan Shingade. I work as a researcher at CARE, and it's my privilege to welcome you to the white paper launch, Experiences of Indian Muslims with Digital Hate, a preliminary report. First, please allow me to offer a karakia before introducing today's topic and the presenters. Whakataka te hau ki te uru. Whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atākura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti he mauriora. Much of our work at CARE is framed with an eye to the aims and activities of decolonization and anti-racism. We're focused on the role of justice-based communication research. And as such, we aim to co-create voice infrastructures at the margins as a basis for articulating health and well-being as a human right. Our work is done anchored in solidarities that are crafted at the margins of the margins, that is, communities marginalized by the colonial capitalist and heteropatriarchal structures. Through our work, we aim to co-create with communities at the grassroots anti-racist solutions and policy frameworks. Now, over the past decade, our research has documented the effects of hate among indigenous communities, African American communities, migrant communities, and hyper-precarious workers too. And over the last 3 years particularly, we have studied the experiences of digital hate among Muslims across these contexts. We have witnessed this form of hate take on unprecedented proportions, and we have felt its presence in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and its harmful and wrongful impact on New Zealand Muslims. The experiences of hate here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, reflected in the terrorist violence of the Christchurch attack, exists in continuity with the experiences of Muslims with hate in India and in the Indian diaspora communities globally. And it is against the backdrop of this context that today's launch of the white paper by CARE, titled Experiences of Indian Muslims with Digital Hate, a preliminary report. It'll be introduced by Professor Mohan J. Datta. Professor Datta is Dean's Chair in Communication and the Director of the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation at Massey University. Kia ora, Professor Datta. Our presenters and respondents today include Sapna Samant, Ashok Swain, Anjum Rahman, and Haroon Kasim. I'll introduce each in turn. Dr. Sapna Samant is a general practitioner and an activist with Hindus for Human Rights and Aotearoa Alliance for Progressive Indians. Over the past decade, Sapna has been a key organizer in Aotearoa, New Zealand in challenging Hindutva. Professor Ashok Swain is Professor of Peace and Conflict Research at Department of Peace and Conflict Research, Uppsala University. In 2019, he was appointed as the UNESCO Chair on International Water Corporation and became the first UNESCO Chair of Uppsala University. Professor Swain's public interventions against hate politics include writing op-eds, offering thought leadership on forums such as this, and countering hate on digital platforms. Anjum Rahman, member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to ethnic communities and women, is a human rights and anti-racist activist. She was a founding member of the New Zealand Islamic Women's Council when it was established in 1990 and served as its first secretary. She is also a founding member of the Hamilton Ethnic Women's Centre, known commonly as Shama, and has served as a trustee on its board since 2002. Rahman was a spokesperson for the Muslim community following the Christchurch mosque shootings, and in its aftermath, she founded the Inclusive Aotearoa Collective to combat discrimination. And Dr. Haroon Kasim resides in Sydney, Australia, and is a medical practitioner. He is the co-founder of the Humanism Project, a collaborative effort to counter the growing hate and divisive agenda of Hindutva at work in India and abroad. Warm welcome, kia ora koutou katoa. And my warm thanks to our viewers for joining us, our presenters today. Uh, the format for today will include a presentation introduced firstly by Professor Datta, followed by our um, respondents respectively, after which we can open our Zoom to your questions, your comments, and allowing time, we will aim to respond to each of those in turn. But firstly, I'd now like to invite Professor Datta to introduce the white paper. And so over to you.
Kia ora koto katoa. Thank you so much, Balamohan, for that introduction. I want to thank our global audience for being here with us in this occasion. I also want to acknowledge the indigenous ancestors of Rangitane, the Tangata Whenua, on whose land and on whose grace we sit in doing this work. Um, Today, as we begin this conversation, I also want to acknowledge our co-panelists who have graciously agreed to engage and interlocute in this conversation. So thank you, Ashok, thank you, Sapna, thank you, Anjum, and thank you, Harun. I will go ahead and share my screen now. So we have titled this particular presentation as Hate, Digital Media and Violence, and will report upon CARE's work sort of in two areas. And before we get into talking about the specifics of the method and the work, just want to offer a couple of pointers. First of all, this is a draft white paper. So please seek the permission from CARE before circulating it. The second thing I want to point out is that in this presentation, there are going to be images and texts shown that might be triggering. So please do consider your safety as you go through the presentation. So what I will do is in the first part of the presentation, I will talk about the digital infrastructures of hate and specifically look at digital platforms, offer you examples of digital content. And we will therefore through this process have a sense of what this digital space looks like. After that, we will look at some of the findings, primarily descriptive data from a survey with the 1,056 Muslims in India. And this survey was carried out in the months of November and December. And here I want to note that the month of December saw the unprecedented rise of hate, anti-Muslim hate in the digital spaces in India, but also in multiple public spaces. So why look at the question of hate? And if you think about broadly the challenges that hate poses to democracies, I want to move from sort of the micro level effects of hate, which are played out on the individual, to the meso level. These are mid-level effects on concepts such as interpersonal trust, community trust, trust in institutions, trust in media, to looking at macro level effects of hate, particularly impacting social cohesion, democracy, peace, and then leading or contributing to genocide. So there is considerable literature, including the work of care in diverse contexts, including with indigenous communities, with African Americans, and the religious minorities, that has documented the effects of hate on human health and well-being. And what we know from this literature is that hate really plays out in three fundamental ways. Hate impacts the mental health of the people that are the targets of hate. It also impacts physical health. So we see this in terms of the chronic diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease. There is a lot of literature on the effects of hate on blood pressure, for instance, on cancer. We also see the effects of hate on aspects such as infant mortality and morbidity. And then overarching well-being of an individual is impacted by the hate environment that she or he might be exposed to. Hate, of course, also plays out in the form of physical violence, which, for instance, in India, we have seen manifest in the form of lynchings, in the forms of attacks on people. We have seen that also in our region, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, particularly in terms of the physical attacks that have been carried out, driven by hate. We also see this in the form of sexual violence, with sexual violence being a key instrument of perpetuating power and control, gendered power and control, and serving the purposes of the racism and hate in that sense. Hate impacts simultaneously, if you look at societal level, interpersonal trust, inter community trust, and through this, then it impacts social cohesion. So if you consider concepts such as social capital, the level of participation of citizens in community life, hate depletes everyday forms of participation and engagement. And through this process, then hate depletes democracies and adversely impacts the ability of citizens to participate effectively in democracies. And it does so by working hand in hand with disinformation. This entire ecosystem of hate then impacts peace, not just within the particular geographical space within which the hate is playing out, but actually in a global context where digital media connect us. We see the effects of this within the broader ambits of regional and global peace. And as we have seen within the context of Myanmar, for instance, this hate, and particularly digital hate, then is a key ingredient in genocide, in the deployment of tropes to kill, murder, erase entire groups or communities of people. So when we move from this to looking at the kind of hate infrastructure of Hindutva, Hindutva once again is a political ideology that seeks to construct India in the image of a Hindu Rashtra or a Hindu nation built upon the notion of a monolithic Hindu jati, meaning a monolithic Hindu race, and a monolithic Hindu Sanskriti or culture. Now, within the landscape of the digital architecture of Hindutva, what we have seen happen since, particularly since 2014, is the proliferation of hate content, specifically targeting Muslims and Christians, with preponderance of the volume and scope of hate targeting Muslims. Now, one of the things that our research, has been able to document when observing these forms of hate that play out digitally is the interplay between Hindutva hate, its Islamophobic elements, and white supremacist hate, the manifestation of which we saw it in Christchurch, and which was driven by Islamophobia. So in this image, for instance, you have Peep the Frog, which is a key symbol in the architecture of white supremacist hate, transformed in spaces like 4chan and then finding its way into Twitter. And then you find Peep the Frog moving from the domain of white supremacist narrative structures to Hindutva structures. So in this particular image, for instance, you see Peep the Frog in saffron. You see the Om symbol on the cap Peep the Frog is wearing. You also see the saffron band that the frog is wearing. And this is deployed within the broader context of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens, which many civil society activists argue have been deployed to disenfranchise India's Muslim minorities. So this particular image then draws in that thread of hate, and particularly anti-immigrant hate, produces India's Muslims as migrants, and then legitimizes forms of violence and torture in that infrastructure. So the memes, in that sense, flow across digital infrastructures of hate from white supremacist spaces to Hindutva supremacist spaces. Now, one of the things that I did during my ethnographic, and particularly the digital ethnographic work, was explore, for instance, responses to events such as the Lynn Mall attack that happened last year. And one of the most powerful things for me to observe there was that most of that Islamophobic content was coming from Hindutva supporters. And then that was piggybacking with white supremacists and going back and forth, building on each other. This is the sort of image that we saw proliferate across digital spaces in 2020, alongside the first wave of COVID in India. And the narratives focused on the framework of Corona Jihad, and framed Muslims as the source of the infections, and Muslims intentionally infecting Hindus, intentionally using their roles as security guards or food delivery people to target the Hindu population. So Muslims weaponizing COVID in order to target Hindus. Now, this had real effects in terms of then violence being played out, targeting Muslims within communities around this Corona Jihad panic. We witnessed hospitals denying treatments to Muslims, sort of drawing upon or resulting from this particular trope. Now, recall how I talked about the flow of memes between spaces of white supremacy and Hindutva supremacy. So here you have the white supremacist image of protecting the purity of the race of the a white Aryan family, and that is then translated to the context of Hindutva, and it says ladies Hindutva protect. So it's deploying that narrative to create this architecture of hate around purity of race, and really drawing upon that fascist theme. You have direct examples of violence. So in this context, again, you have Peep the Frog with the Om symbol on the hat, carrying out violence. Here you have Peep the Frog in saffron, again, wearing a tikka, driving over a Muslim. And the caption on top of this image says Marja Mother Chot, means die, you and then uses an expletive. Um, we also see multiple spaces of violence, particularly sexual violence, targeting Muslim women, particularly in spaces like Reddit, subreddits. You see narratives that specifically focus on Muslim women and deploy various forms of sexual violence targeting Muslim women. We saw this play out two times at least in terms of public discourse. Once in Sully deals where Muslim women were put for auction, and again bully deals that happened later last year in December, putting Muslim women, particularly Muslim journalists, activists, critical voices for auction within these spaces. There have been a number of news stories that have come out that have depicted these forms of violence. And a key point also to be noted here is that the explicitly Islamophobic content is intertwined with content that targets India's oppressed caste communities, Dalits. So the question that I will move into now is in terms of how then is this infrastructure of hate perceived by Muslims? So in this survey that we carried out in November and December specifically, and the sample was 541 men, 513 women. 87% of the sample was below 45. So this is a fairly young sample. This was also an educated sample in the sense that 38% of the sample had a bachelor's degree and 37% of the sample had a master's degree. So this is reflective of the digital platform on which this data was gathered. In terms of income, again, we see a large proportion of the sample in the middle rung. So 28.7% of the sample earning between 10,000 rupees and 20,000 rupees, and 31.8% of the sample earning between 20,000 rupees and 50,000 rupees. So when the sample is asked whether they have been called offensive names in the past 12 months, 39% of them say that they have been. 40% of them say that they have been targeted on social media as a result of being a Muslim. Now, when we look at whether they have come across content that encourages conflict on digital platforms, what we see here again is that 64% of the sample says that they have come across content that encourages conflict, going from somewhat agree, mostly agree to strongly agree. Then we think about that question of Corona Jihad narrative. So what percentage of Muslim participants have come across that narrative? We see 64% of them saying that they have come across content that blames Muslims for the pandemic. Now, one of the powerful narratives and connected to the Corona Jihad story or similar to it is the love jihad narrative, which is Muslims targeting Hindu women for conversion through romance or marriage. And what we see here is 58.9, so almost 59% of the participants saying that they have come across content on digital platforms stating Muslims target Hindu women for marriage. Now, this is where we started looking at dehumanizing content. The literature asserts that when we start moving into communication content that compares a community to animals, that level of dehumanization is a vital step toward greater hate, violence, and perhaps genocide. And what we see here is 55% of the sample saying or agreeing with the statement that they have come across content on digital platforms that compares Muslims to pigs and dogs. the narrative of Muslim immigrants taking over, which was a key thread around CAA, NRC. What we see is 56% of the sample saying that they have come across digital content that states that Muslim immigrants will take over India. Now, what we see in our qualitative work, in our interviews that we have carried out, is that a lot of this narrative is around framing everyday Muslims as the illegal immigrant. And then finally, when it comes to this question of content that incites violence against Muslims, we have 60% of the participants saying that they have come across content on digital platforms that incites violence against Muslims. So how does all this impact the sense of safety or security of Muslims? Remember, I talked about a range of variables in terms of outcomes. So let's just look at the sense of um, security, and really measured in terms of perceptions of worry, with participants talking about, I worry about my safety. So this was measured by 3 items, with a Cronbach's alpha, which gives you a measure of reliability of 0.9. And what you see in this is that, so the dependent variable is the perception of security vis-a-vis worry about security. And what you see here is that 7.9% of that variance in perception is explained by the demographics. But beyond the demographic step 1, what you see is exposure to social media explains 30.4% of the variance, with the correlation being at 0.56 and highly significant. And the entire model explains 38.3% of the variance in perceptions of worry. So what is this telling us? What we are learning from this round of data gathering and these preliminary analysis is that the exposure to hate content on digital platforms directly impacts the sense of everyday well-being, the sense of security experienced by Muslims. And this study, in this sense, takes us beyond simply mapping the digital content to actually looking at effects. I think there is cause for concern, and more research is needed then in terms of how this perception of security impacts overarching social cohesion and peace. And for those of us in the diaspora, this actually then relates to how is this hate, because hate flows across borders. Hate is not contained within borders. How is this hate contributing to threats to social cohesion and peace and democracy in democracies across the globe? And most importantly, what kinds of preventive strategies and policy solutions can we really think about? So I'm really looking forward to our panelists to hear about the kinds of solutions we can imagine. So let's go ahead with you, Sapna. Sapna, you're on mute.
All right, kia ora, everybody. I'm just going to do a wee paper before I start on what I think of Mohan's research. So yeah, ko Sayadri tuku Maunga, ko Arabian Sea tuku Moana, ko Ngāti Indian tuku Iwi, ko Maharashtra tuku Hapu, ko Mumbai Aho, no Mumbai Aho, I beg your pardon, ko Tamaki Makaurau tuku Kainga, ko Sapna Samant tuku Ingoa. This is just me, and I come from Mumbai, Maharashtra, and my mountain is Sayadri, and my sea is, my body of water is the Arabian Sea. This is the way we introduce ourselves over here. And also, before I start, I want to acknowledge the people of this land where I stand on, Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, the people of this land, Ngāti Whātua, and for the privilege that I have of being here in a safe, secure environment, being able to have these discussions and talk about how we can use our privilege to prevent or, shine a light on these things. Yes, and learning from the struggles of the colonized indigenous people over here. Yes, so Mohan's the white paper is just really significant because the way I look at it, this is not something recent. It has been ongoing since before India became independent. Happy Republic Day, by the way. And it's not just the overtly Hindu, right-wing Hindus that have caused this to happen, but also, I would say, the Congress Party with their soft Hindutva for a really, really long time. They may have deemed the RSS as a terrorist organization twice, but still it's the soft Hindutva that took place and was perpetuated in everyday lives of Indians, and the stereotyping of Muslims. So many instances, not enough time to mention over here. So I would say that the Congress is equally responsible for where we are today. It's not something just what the Hindu Mahasabha or RSS or Savarkar's teachings that have come through the generations. The other thing I wanted why we are here today, I would say, is so this is a macro picture, is when Manmohan Singh liberalized the country in 1992, and we went full mode neoliberal, the middle class anxieties that grew with material wealth, there was no place to anchor those anxieties except in sort of harking back to some mythical Bharat, where things were much better and everybody was rich and etc. And there was no, when you gather, you want this Western material wealth, but there is no way where you can work with those anxieties that come from not only accumulating all of this wealth, but you don't know how to negotiate that. This is where I would say, I mean, this is a hypothesis, but I would say this is a place where people have gone back into time, some mythical time, talking about Hindu Rashtra, Bharat, all of these names. And so in a way, material wealth, Western material wealth and all the Western stuff is really, really bad. You still want it, but you don't know how to deal with it. And so you just dig in, and that cognitive dissonance just grows and grows and grows, and you take it out in hate. And then, of course, the Hindutva long-term project, which has been going on since before independence. I mean, generations, it's just really, really sad, but generations of Indians have been indoctrinated, Hindus have been indoctrinated to believe in this very specific, singular, monolithic worldview. So the neural pathways in the brain, if you look at it from a psychological or a medical perspective, the neural pathways that develop in the brain of a child, of an infant, they've just been so hardened in one specific way that there's no flexibility over there. And this is why we see these young people doing the solidales and the bully by and all the horrible language they use on the Twitter spaces, particularly against Muslim women, but against women in general. So these are the couple of things that we should be really looking at as well, is not just Hindutva RSS teachings, but the sort of the macro world in which this came about to be. And it plays out in New Zealand. It plays out in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Anecdotally, we know Muslims, Indian Muslims particularly over here, who feel alienated within the community, who have no place where they can be Indian, where they can, those cultural specificities that come with them, they're not there. And then, of course, we have what happened in Christchurch was such a tragedy. I don't think the New Zealand government has done enough. to shine a light on this. It's all about mitigation for their own selves. It's not about the community. It's not about people. And so going in there and questioning the real Islamophobia at grassroots level is just not happening. And so the Indian Muslim over here find themselves stuck between this alienation from their own community when they should be embraced, and this happening with the government. And words, the Ministry of Ethnic Communities throwing words like social cohesion. What does that even mean when our own Indian community is being, so much discrimination going on within the Indian community? So I think Mohan's paper is just really relevant. It's not just about India. We should be looking at how that carries over here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or even in Australia or anywhere else, in the diasporic communities that wherever Indians are. And we should actually be researching those Indian Muslims that live in these Western spaces and how they're affected by what is going on back in India and the digital hate. It's sad, because when I look at what is happening to Rana Ayub just after she tweeted about Yemen and the kind of stuff that she faces, is just so-called liberal Indians talking against her for this tweet instead of having a legitimate discussion. That is the level of hate, digital hate, that is happening towards Indian Muslims. And Rana is a very, very strong woman. She's a well-known woman, and she can stand up for herself. But there are so many women Indian Muslim women, who just are not able to, because this is just really overwhelming. So this white paper should be explored some more, and we should particularly look at how it is panning out in the Indian Muslim communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sapna. There is so much to process there. Really appreciate you situating this within a broader context historically and connecting this to soft Hindutva and the neoliberal project. And thank you for really pointing out the relevance of listening to the voices of Muslim Indians, particularly in the diaspora here, because something that we consistently see in the work that we have done so far here is how often Muslim Indians say that their voices are not being heard. And really appreciate you putting the Crown infrastructure under the scanner, if you will, and really talk about what that looks like, and sort of the need for doing more scholarship here, particularly that examines how Indian Muslims in New Zealand are responding to this hate. So thank you so much. We have the privilege of having with us Professor Ashok Swain, who will respond next. As I was saying earlier, it really is a pleasure to have you with us, Ashok, and such an inspiration with all your public interventions into this infrastructure of hate.
Thank you. I was a bit difference. I was not glad that I'm here. I must congratulate one white paper which has formally up, but
Ashok,
needed.
Ashok,
Sorry,
I can't really hear you. The sound is distorted.
Oh. Computer, can I?
Do you want to speak directly to the computer and see if that works?
Can
No, it still is distorted.
yeah, like something like a reboot button. So
That's a good idea, Professor Suaid. I think try the computer, and in the meantime, we'll just go to a different speaker. How does that sound? We'll if Anjum Rahman is available to speak next. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll hand it over to you to speak to this.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Kia ora koutou, everyone. I'm also going to start with a short pepeha, as Sapna did. Tēnā koutou katoa, he uri tēnei no inia, ko kirikiri roa toku whatu manawa, ko Waikato te awa e mahia nei aku mā harahara, kei kirikiri roa aho e noho ana I naine, ko Anjum Rahman toku ingoa. I'm settled and based here in the Waikato, Hamilton, New Zealand, and I'd like to acknowledge the people of this land who are Ngāti Wairiri, Ngāti Mahanga, and Ngāti Haua. I thought I'd begin by first talking a little bit about my personal background and then talking about the New Zealand context and developments, then giving you or showing you some examples of posts that are being seen here from people in New Zealand posting on New Zealand sites, and then talk a little bit about the impact of what we're seeing, and then finish off by talking about what we need to see happening. So I was born in a village in Azamgarh Zilla in Uttar Pradesh. My parents were both born in the district. My maternal grandmother was born in what was then called Banaras. But as far as I know, my father has done a family tree going back several generations on both sides, all from within the area of Azamgarh. I left India when I was just under 2 and we moved to Canada, and then we arrived in Aotearoa, New Zealand when I was 5 years old. My first trip back at 12 years old, and I think that was 1978, so I'm aging myself here, which is all good. It really was a culture shock. I mean, prior to going back, I had seen Bollywood movies. My parents had been very strong in speaking the language. We spoke Urdu at home. We mixed with other Indians, but it's not the same as actually living in India. So it was quite a bit of culture shock for me. We went back frequently over the years after that to the villages and then to Aligarh, where my then in-laws lived. So I was in India on 6th of December 1992 when the Babri Masjid fell. And actually that day is my father's birthday, which makes it much easier to remember that date. But really, I remember it because of the fear that we felt. We had full martial law. There were black flags flying everywhere. And I remember the riots. Luckily, because we were under martial law, there were not riots in Aligarh. But we could see the news and we would hear the experiences of the riots and the violence that were happening in other parts of the country. And in fact, I wrote about my experience in the spin-off website with a piece called The Saffron Sari, which was about traveling to Delhi in the immediate aftermath of those riots, the police escort to the train station, the eerie emptiness in the streets and the station. In terms of a New Zealand context, in the 1970s and until relatively recently, there has been no tension between communities within the Indian diaspora here. We have coexisted and gotten along very well. In fact, when we shifted here to Kirikiriroa, Hamilton, there were so few Muslims in our region that our closest family friends were Hindu Indians. And I remember how we would always be there for each other in difficult times and happy times, and illness and death. And there was so much love, so much respect. And outside of our own circle, there were some comments that were concerning, but they were very few and far between. For the local Muslim community, our environment here in general, there were certain things that were happening in the global space that were impacting us here. So the bombing of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in the US, the resulting war on terror, the Bali bombings, Danish cartoons, then more recently Daesh and the situation in Iraq and Syria, which has been awful and horrendous. Now, alongside these events that were creating strong negative press, negative commentary against the Muslim community, we saw the rise of online platforms. And with these platforms were the algorithms that led to the viral spread of hate messages. You have algorithms related to the likes and shares on various social media platforms. You have recommendation algorithms, so whether it's YouTube or Google or other platforms that are recommending material. And it was interesting, I don't know if people have seen recently the Wired article about tech fog, and I can post a link to the article in the comment section later. But this tech fog app, the way that it was used to hijack Twitter and Facebook and WhatsApp with automated retweets and auto sharing, a spamming of existing hashtags to create fake trends. It allowed the generation of temporary email addresses to create fake accounts. And all of this was affecting WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Telegram. And they were targeting inactive WhatsApp accounts and using these to impersonate people. And so what happened is that the impact of these hateful messages has been so much stronger and higher, and it has created this environment where people are taken in by this. A lot of times it's hate material or it's misinformation, and that has had much more of an impact compared to previous times. I mean, we still have things like talkback radio, newspaper columns and opinion pieces that had impact, but the online space has been even stronger. And so I will try and just now show you some examples of, with sharing my screen, of some examples of what we've been seeing in the New Zealand space. So this is, and I'll just quickly scroll through some of this material. This is the Indians in New Zealand Facebook page, and these are the admins, the administrators of this page. The page has now, as far as I know, been removed from Facebook. But one of the things that we had was, we had these, what was happening is that they would post material, which I will show you, but they would remove commenting rights for anyone that challenged the material that was being posted. So what that meant was that they could post hateful messages, people could make hateful comments under those posts, and anyone who was responding would have their ability to post or comment turned off. So which left a really one-sided commentary. And so this is, some of the posts that we were seeing. The language, which if you don't speak Indian, I can say that it is quite abusive language with swear words and so on. And the memes, of course, which this is one of the milder ones, indicating that the left is sucking up to Islamic extremists. And some of the commentary is just people just being nasty to one another, but some of the memes can get really ugly. So I might move to the next page, but yeah, so it's the framing of Muslims and the Muslim community as opposed to Hindu communities. It's ridiculing and you know, other kinds of memes that will create a negative feeling. And each one of these comments in and of itself is not, you know, each one is bad, but it's not terrible. But I think the issue is when there's so much, and there was so much material. And of course, as Professor Mohan had indicated, that, you know, the blaming of the spread of the coronavirus, that kind of material was popping up here as well. And just like nonsense, like horrible material, one-sided, that, you know, calling us cockroaches and so on, dehumanization. We were seeing all this kind of stuff happening here. More of the COVID blame, and so on. So, and one of the most, this was one of the comments around the, oh, sorry, it's not loading, there you go, around protests for the CAA. And there was a lot, like this is just one example, there was so much of this kind of commentary. And this one was recent, within the last couple of months. And this is a person who is registered financial advisor, happy to have his name on a public post and putting up this kind of material. And then a person, you know, that is responding in support, again, well-known, he's well-known in political circles, and quite happy to support this kind of posting. So we can see that what is happening in India is, in fact, you know, is seeping into New Zealand. And Professor Mohan has talked about a lot of the impacts. For us, it's like access to services. We have people like this that are posting these kind of commentary that, you know, we've had people working in Auckland City Council, we've had people working in government and other places. And we think about, you know, what impact this has on access to services when these people are making decisions about us, about our children's education, about policy and funding decisions. Now, we expressed similar concerns to the government from back in 2016, 2017 about white supremacists and white nationalists who have a documented history of trying to infiltrate law enforcement, the armed forces, and the teaching profession. Other impacts are not getting access to employment as people are making decisions based on these false stereotypes. I've done a lot of work in the area of family violence and sexual violence, and we know that abuse, emotional abuse, and the emotional impacts of verbal, emotional, and psychological violence is still violence, even though it isn't often treated as seriously as physical violence. It can be even worse in many instances. And for us, there was two things. So you have the lower level material, but the volume of it is so much that it creates an environment that is very hostile. Or you might have just one or two instances, but the material is so damaging that it can have a long-lasting impact. Other impacts are around fears for our safety. Overseas, we've seen that online harm then translates to offline harm, and we've talked about lynchings, beatings, killings. And the thing is that if we as community members speak in any way at all about any of these impacts, the volume of the pushback using these apps like the TechFog app, that we're playing the victim card, that we don't support free speech, that we can't handle criticism, all of this pushback, the aim is actually to silence us, to marginalize us, and at the extreme end, it's about ethnic cleansing. And it's also a very effective tool for political power to create an enemy that is perceived to have little ability to push back. Another silencing tactic is claims of Hinduphobia, and I want to make absolutely clear here that we have absolutely no beef with the Hindu religion, with people that follow Hinduism. But as the material you've seen has been, some of it explicitly violent, some of it explicitly hateful. These are not just discussions of disagreements. These are full-on attacks at volume. And it's interesting that they criticize us for not wanting free speech when actually all of these tactics are trying to remove our free speech and our presence online and in other spaces. Obviously, the impact in India is worse, which we're seeing, entrenched poverty, exclusion, erasure of cultural and historic heritage, historical revisionism. But what we're also seeing with the diaspora is interference with elections. And definitely I've seen evidence in Canada and the UK, and there is a danger that it will happen here, and that people can bypass our electoral law by the use of encrypted messaging apps like WhatsApp or Signal and so on. And many people here from the diaspora communities don't understand local electoral laws, so don't even know that they can complain to the Electoral Commission about some of this material that is going around. So what we want to see is we need our authorities and our elected representatives to take this very seriously. Just as we were warning about white supremacist hate before the Christchurch mosque attacks, we know that this is also a significant threat that needs to be addressed. We know that there was a significant proportion of resources from intelligence agencies and the police put into surveilling the Muslim community, particularly prior to May 2018. And we need to know that these issues that we have been raising for a couple of years now, we need to know that they are going to be taken equally seriously. It is not an over-there problem, something that's happening in another country. It's a problem that is here, and it's one that needs to be addressed here. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Anjum, for that comprehensive presentation and connecting it powerfully to Aotearoa. That content that you brought out is so concerning. But what is also powerful is how you then sort of attended to this idea that if people holding these ideologies are within Crown infrastructures or are employed by the Crown, there are tremendous implications for that for Muslims. So how does one address that? And I think that's a real challenge for the Crown. You also, brought up this idea that sort of the way in which you have and Muslims have brought up white supremacy in the past, and the role of the Crown in employing white supremacists, and how those voices were not listened to. I think there's a real question about whether these voices that are bringing up the concerns about Islamophobia and Hindutva driven hatred are actually being listened to, and how can the Crown structures respond to that. What I found really concerning in your presentation is how you documented people within everyday communities, community leaders, people within political parties, mainstream political parties, these are not fringe, that sort of participate in dialogue with some of this hate content. That is really concerning. And one thing I do wonder is what responsibilities do our political parties have to play, do our Crown infrastructures have to play in actually responding to this, because you simply cannot turn the other way under some kind of superficial narrative of multiculturalism and say that, oh, this is just a conflict within ethnic communities, because you're once again feeding that kind of Islamophobia and hate. And it's quite a paradox when that is being done in the backdrop of the Christchurch call and sort of a lot of rhetorical flourish claiming to build social cohesion. So really, thank you. And I just want to also point out your question about electoral politics and democracy. I think, that's something we have to grapple with, because, tech fog, you brought up that example. How can that impact elections in Aotearoa, New Zealand? And given how porous our borders are, that's a real concern, isn't it?
But it's also, Mohanbhai, it's also about, when political material is put out, you need to have an authorization statement. You need to have a name. These are some basic facets of our electoral law. And a lot of this material, as I said, being shared on encrypted apps, has none of that. It has no name. It has no authorization. You can't hold anyone responsible. And people are just sharing it willy-nilly, without thinking about who is the source. Is it accurate? Is it fair? It's very sad.
Yeah, what a brilliant presentation, and you have given a lot of fodder for our policymakers, Anjumji. Thank you. Shall we try and see if we can bring Ashok back in, and hopefully this will work.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, this is working lovely. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I'm sorry about all these challenges, but as you know, I mean, we are living in that kind of world. But I must congratulate you for this bringing out this white paper, because I think, as we all know, that this kind of work is not possible now. The universities in India, we are not even allowed to talk to them. So in this context, it's important that wherever this type of research or this sort of work can be done, we should do this, because I think it's extremely important thing to need to be brought out. Unless we talk about it, the situation will be reaching in a point that when we don't have anything to talk about. I think what is happening, the hate against the minorities, or particularly Muslims, is not anything new in Indian context. It has been there all the time. What is new now has happened is that it's something has two things. One, that this, what you have brought it out, that there's a digital medium is available, which has made it much worse because it's anonymized. But there is a political support, which is open political support, which helps these things. And I think we need to understand that though there is a digital medium is there, and there is anonymized, there are groups which do not really need to go through all kinds of checking and all sort of, they can do whatever they want to. There is no restrictions, there is no control. But even the regular media in that has become also openly propagating hate against minorities, particularly Muslims. And those have been happening because of the complete political backing. And the political support, I think what we need to see that if we are, I mean, you collected the data in November, December, but we also saw there has been also rise, not only against Muslims, the hate, but also against the Christians and Sikhs also have come up in that period. It has been going on, but also in December time, we see there is a massive increase in this kind of hate things coming up in a different type of ways in the media, in the media. But we need to realize that there has been there is certain kind of control or certain kind of some way maintaining some sort of sanity when they go against the Christians, particularly, because there is always there is an international community. Some of the countries come against, and that helps. That puts them pressure that they don't really need to can do it openly as they can do it with the Muslims. And I think against Muslims, which has become much more easier, because I think the countries with whom they do have they should support, they should get some kind of opposition or some kind of criticism, they are silent. Because it helps them politically to do so, because the adding, targeting Muslims, targeting Pakistan, targeting Kashmir, these are all connected with this kind of philosophy that helps them politically. That doesn't get them any kind of international censor, because as we all know, that is also international. I mean, that the Islamophobia is not only limited to India. It has other, I mean, larger support, larger constituency outside. So I think in that sense, it has become much worse. And these situations, I think we need to really look at it, what is where it is leading to, what it will continue to be. And I think the way you will see the Indian context, particularly how they are looking at it, what kind of, because as I said, the public discourse is very completely missing. There is certain kind of voices which want to say some things. They are also suppressed. The liberal, so-called liberal voices in India, they are there to some extent, but they don't really come out openly, and they are much more restrictive when the things comes against Muslims. So I think it is somehow extremely problematic to realize that what is happening there. There is all these kind of discussions that where it will lead to, because I think this kind of talk which goes on that there will be a possibility of civil war, but I don't. I mean, but I think you mentioned, Mohan, in the beginning, it's a genocide is the right way to look at it, because if you look at our demography in the country, the way the situation is, overwhelming domination of majority in almost all parts of the country, it is very difficult to enter into see a possibility of civil war taking place. But the genocide is something which is the real threat. It's a genocide. It's certain way it is happening of not directly killing the people, but killing the idea, killing the religion, killing the group in many other ways, taking away. I mean, what is happening with this kind of digital medium, the hate? You see there are many aspects of it. One is directly targeting them, the physical harms to be done. That has become open. That has become, if you commit those kind of physical harm to a Muslim community, it is not anymore a crime. As I keep on saying, a cow's life in India is much more important now than a Muslim's life. But I think if you kill a cow, you are almost going to be lynched. But if you lynch a Muslim, you are almost going to be a member of parliament. So in a sense, it has become very, very, different way of the kind of the direct violence against the Muslims. But also it takes away, it undermines the faith, it undermines the group, it creates all kinds of way of looking at it. And even the educated mass, the people with whom you have studied, and you thought that they are educated, they had certain secular value. When I grew up, when I studied with my students, friends in JNU, and when the kind of messages comes in the WhatsApp group, you will be totally surprised to see that these people can behave or can look at this situation, particularly at the time of Corona in 2020. The way the presentation of the whole Muslim community, as if there is a carrier, they are the ones those who have to be blamed for Corona, despite everything was there, which this kind of things which never occurred to them that they can logically argue with them. So I think it is some things also, if not, there are individual killings, there is the idea of undermining the whole group as such, that is creating, but also at the same time, there is taking away the whatever professions they do have. If you go back to this, I mean, everyone talking about that the previous regimes where there was a bias against minorities, it was a minority appeasement, that the word which you used to hear that time. But when you look at the statistics, what has happened? The Muslims are the poorer, the poverty rate among the Muslims is like Dalits in India. That Dalits have at least some reservations officially, constitutionally, that the Muslims don't have. the Muslim population is 14 to 15%, whereas their percentage of job in the all kinds of government jobs for 3 to 4%. The kind of jobs in the military or in the police sector also for 3 to 4%. So they have never got their share, even in the government infrastructure, the government institutions. But at the same time, the economy, the bank loans, you look at it, they have been completely marginalized for a long period of time. So they have been economically marginalized before, they have been socially marginalized before, but now what is happening is they're politically being marginalized, and that's where where the real challenge is, because the hope has gone out. That the hope, at least through political means, through certain kind of representation in the political process, there was a hope in the Muslim community that they will change somewhat the situation, but that is not anymore there. So politically they have been marginalized. Whatever the limited economic activities they were engaged in, that is being taken out with all kinds of ways. Formally, it has been there before, but informally, even in the informal sectors, when the Muslims were there, the kind of the digital media is trying to take them out. There have been thousands of people gathering on areas that taking oath, like Nazi style oath, that not to do any business with Muslims, or not to buy anything from the Muslims, not to employ them. I mean, those things which comes in that anywhere in the world, it would create a real such a issue, but it doesn't happen anymore in India. World is silent. Of course, we don't really need to expect the world to do much, to be honest. World cannot do these things even in the smaller countries in Africa or in the Middle East. What do you expect them to do in the country of 1.4 billion? It's only Indians have to do it. It's only Indians need to know that what they can do, what they should not do, what they are a country, why they are a country, and why they will survive as a country. So it's this kind of, that's where the scary part of it, when and where there is some things within India will come that this is the way not to go and we need to stop. And I think that's what needs to be, all kinds of work needs to be done, whichever way we can support that some sort of awareness of that the Indian society, which has been living for a long period of time in a certain manner, that needs to be protected to some extent, that needs to be improved rather than going in this way. And I think this is where this report, as I find, is a contribution to that kind of opening the eyes of the people, those who are completely in a certain way of thinking, which just I'm scared that it might or it has all the ingredients of leading to a genocide. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Ashok, for that powerful sharing. What I think is very instructive in what you shared is sort of the overarching infrastructure of marginalization that has a long history, particularly the economic, social marginalization, which then sort of is complemented by this form of political marginalization with sort of this regime, and particularly the last round of electoral victory of this regime. Something that you said, it is so powerful in terms of the life of a cow in India being more valued than the life of a Muslim, and how then that connects with this broader idea of genocide as erasure of the way of life, the way of being of a community. The things that you pointed to, particularly most recently, what we have seen with the taking of the Nazi-style oaths, not to support Muslim businesses, and not to employ Muslims, really raise powerful questions about how close we are really, or how close India is already perhaps to that large scale erasure, because these are everyday people. It seemed like many of these oaths were being taken in public parks. What would be your morning yoga? And then this is being done. So it almost seems like it is routinized or normalized in certain spaces. So, that really offers a vital question that you sort of wrapped up with, which is what then needs to happen to build that awareness, to mobilize, that Indians need to mobilize to actually take back some semblance of democracy, some semblance of harmony. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is something which we see. There has been a number of attacks which are taking place by the liberals or the academics and intelligentsia in India, that the opposition is failing. I do have, I think I do have, I agree to some extent. Yes, opposition hasn't succeeded, but I think if you look at this kind of right-wing populists, wherever they are, when they bring the ethno-nationalism to the force, the usual political oppositions do not find how way to address it. So that's where we have to look at globally. I mean, you can't blame whoever was in the opposition what happened in Germany in 1940s, or whoever was. You can't blame Hillary what Trump did. If America can, and still Trump is defeated though in technically, but it's still he's running the whole American discourse now. But I think we need to realize that the opposition has the problem in this case, because opposition cannot really fight, the regular opposition party cannot fight an ethno-nationalist force. So I think here the civil society has a strong role to play. But what has happened with the civil society? I'm sorry to think, but I think
this is beautiful. Please.
It's an important point. But what happened to the civil society? Part of larger civil society has been co-opted or has been controlled by the RSS. I mean, which calls it a civil society organizations. But then the others, those who were there, which India was actually quite rich with various civil society organizations. Some of these, many of them have co-opted, some of them are silent, some of them have suppressed, because if you look at it, 16 to 18,000 NGOs don't even get the foreign assistance anymore, because in different, even, they have even gone into the all sorts of ways, stopping, forget amnesty, even they stopped all sorts of organizations are facing serious trouble, those who could really speak the voice. And those who are there, either they are dependent on the central government money, or they will not make their life. So I think and then the liberals, or the so-called intelligentsia, those who have closed their mind in the 2013-14, particularly from 2011 to 2014, criticizing the previous government, which had a lot of ways you should criticize them, but they didn't realize what are the alternatives available. They were trying, even while in the flow of criticizing the government, they were even trying to justify the kind of regime which was coming in. And now, rather than accepting their fault, they're putting the blame on the opposition. So it's one sense, the civil society is completely marginalized or silenced or co-opted, and the intelligentsia, the academics, they knew that they had done a mistake, but rather than owning it, they are putting the blame on the opposition. And the opposition is not able to come out because opposition has its own problem of coming out against ethno-nationalist forces. So we are in this kind of dilemma in the situation.
Wow. This thing that you brought up about academics and sort of intellectuals that had actually genuflected to this ethno-nationalist forces. I remember reading op-ed after op-ed talking about how this particular force is going to be transformative, and we don't really need to worry about the hate politics.
And they were the one legitimized the one, because they were the one which are highly respected people, continue to be respected, senior professor abroad and also India. And if you justify someone whom you know that kind of mentality for ages, he didn't come, or that person didn't come from the heaven or Mars. He was there. I mean, you have watched at least minimum 15 years before getting in there.
Yeah, there was a track record there. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ashok. It's been a beautiful conversation, and look forward to continuing this. You pose a really powerful question about what's to be done, and I think I hope that we reflect on that, and more importantly, find strategies around it, So with that, I would love to invite Dr. Haroon Kasim, who's with the Humanism Project, who will talk about strategies as a way to wrap us up.
Thanks very much, Mohan, and it's just an honor being a part of this panel with Ashok, Anjum, and Sapna. Sorry, I might just start by sharing the slide. Yep. So I'm just going to take off from where you left, Mohan, in terms of what has happened since 2019. I'm going to address a few things from here. One is what happens immediately because of this, some really human stories, right? And two human stories that come to my mind after the COVID jihad was one woman who was pregnant, who was bleeding, who goes to the hospital in Rajasthan, and they deny her care because she's a Muslim, and obviously she could be spreading coronavirus, and she died, right? That was gut-wrenching. Another story that comes to my mind is a book written by a woman called Nazia Ezram, and she wrote a book called Mothering the Muslim. And in that, she talks of this poignant story where I think it was her or someone, they're driving in a car with a child at the back who's been pummeled with these stories of Muslims being terrorists. And he suddenly wakes up and he's afraid, he's flustered. And the mom asks the son, "Hey, what's happening?" And he says, the Muslims are coming after me. I dreamt that the Muslims are coming after me. And this guy was a Muslim himself, right? It was heartbreaking. And another poignant story on where this young child, who's about 7 years old, has a conversation with his Hindu friend. And he says, "Look, I'm not like the other Muslims. I don't eat beef." And you look at it and say, how deeply has this, affected our society? So that's what's done immediately, right? And the question, of course, is why does it occur? Why does it occur? And another story, if I may. And I was puzzled, right? Because I've been in India for some time, and this sudden escalation of hate was just fascinating. So I was talking to one of the civil rights activists, the civil society activists in India, a very prominent person, and I was trying to make sense of all this. And he said he talked to his mom about it. And this guy is one of the first people who resigned his IAS job because of the CNRC. And he was from the southern Indian state where you don't have the communal discord all that much. And he asked his mom, "Mom, this story about COVID jihad and Muslims spreading COVID? What do you think about that? And people are saying they should be shot and all of that. What do you think about that? Do you know Muslims?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, look, I know Muslims. I know Muslims since my childhood." And she says, and he says, "Well, then what do you think about Muslims?" And he said, "Oh, they've been very helpful since our childhood." And he goes, "What do you think about this COVID jihad narrative? Should we shoot them?" And she says, "Yeah, I don't know why they're spreading COVID jihad. And if we don't have an option, what else can we do?" You see, and this is a woman who all her life knew Muslims, right? And the question is, why does this occur? And that's what I'm going to talk about, if I may. So this sorry, this is the dangerous speech content, and what Mohan very characteristically described is goes through phases, right? Dehumanization. You talked about, we heard about people being called cockroaches and in vermin. Our home minister very famously said that was Kireko. I'm not very good at Hindi, but he said he's going to take the termites and throw them away during the CNRC, and they attribute guilt, right? Because they're there, they're going to be terrorists, they're going to be a threat. That's a threat construction. And then what typically happens, as it happened in the coronavirus case, was that you don't have any alternative. You got to, you got to find some solution to it, and that's usually violent extremism. And then you talk a virtue talk. You see, people who do that are good people. People who don't do that, are leftists, are jihadis, or what have you. And so even the dissenting Hindus are actually demonized. And then you have this future bias saying that if we did that, you have a Hindu Rashtra, and that's going to be fine. And that is really consistent with some other images that Mohan showed. So by doing this, what you've done is you've polarized the population, and then you prepare for extermination, which really is genocide, right? And we've seen that pattern happen over and over and over again. And interestingly, this is also the same playbook that was used by the Nazis, the Hutus, the Tutsi, the Hutus against the Tutsis, and so on and so forth. And so what we find here, so the question is, what can we do about it? What happened in that civil society activist's mother's case was that she was being pummeled over and over and over again, and we were just watching for her to subscribe to a dangerous ideology. So she was a woman who was resistant to hate. Then she becomes indifferent to hate. Then she becomes a passive supporter, an active supporter. Then she collaborates, and she might even be a perpetuator if you let her be. So the intervention rarely occurs in any of these places, right? And so then what happens is this actually contributes to the first four stages of genocide, as described by Gregory Stanton. Then it just seamlessly progresses: organization, polarization, preparation, then you persecute them, exterminate. We are about here, I think, because they've already been, I'll come to that shortly. And we, at none of these stages, we intervene at all, right? And if you look at the genesis in the Indian context, start off with stripping of citizenship, all that talk about Gaddaron ko Goli Maro in the Delhi program, then the code jihad bomb. And now you can't pray on the road because you get assaulted, and you can't even pray. So it's your freedoms are getting restricted. And now you promote very grotesque sexual violence against Muslim women and children. Now there's calls of genocide. Where are we going next? Well, it's not hard to guess. So what's happening is we have chosen not to address dangerous speech early on and not to criminalize it, and we're allowing it to progress. And what we need to do, and the question is, why does it occur, right? Because we don't have universally validated frameworks that can proactively recognize and address dangerous speech and prevent genocide. And if you were to compare that with the clinical model, which is, I'm a doctor, what we do is we intervene when people are well, we reduce their risk factors so that they're healthy. They intervene in subclinical disease, reviewing them periodically so that they don't develop clinical disease. Again, with clinical disease, we make sure they're taken well in the community and to prevent them from being hospitalized. And even after they're hospitalized, even when they're dying, we make sure that they have a peaceful end. On the contrary, we don't intervene here at all, just re-emphasizing that that's really because we don't have validated frameworks to proactively recognize and address dangerous speech. So we don't do anything proactively, and that's a big part of the problem. So what is the opportunity? The opportunity, of course, is considerable academic research and understanding and proactively addressing dangerous speech in the past decade, and support from social media companies. Twitter has already adopted the dehumanizing framework, and civil society and governmental organizations want to look at that because this thing causes social discord. Right here in Sydney, that resulted in violence against the Sikh community. And so there's an increasing interest to proactively recognize and effectively address dangerous speech and prevent genocide. And The thing is, if we don't do it, genocide will occur and continue to occur, and the quoted sentiment of never again will become time and time again. Not my quote; it's Adama Dieng's quote. And so, what we are trying to do is some really good work being done by Professor Datta is engage the community and try to understand and figure out the concepts of dangerous speech so that we can proactively recognize and intervene. And what does intervention mean? It could be, community organizations that promote dangerous speech should be defunded. Right, these should be inbuilt into policy funding mechanisms, so that if we find even any remote inkling of dangerous speech, they should be defunded, and they should be subject to punitive measures, punitive remedial measures, and that's something we've been exploring with a lot of bodies, and there's a lot of interest in it. So our view is that we should not wait for hate speech. We should intervene at the level of social discord, and there's a huge window of opportunity where we can. And that's exactly what we're working on doing with Professor Datta and other stakeholders. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Harun. So powerful as always. And I think what is really insightful once again is how you demonstrate the movement of hate across the various layers into genocide. And what is really concerning is what in that analysis you point to in terms of where we are at with Hindutva and Islamophobia. But what is also really powerful, I think, and really inspiring every time that I speak with you, Arun, is sort of a solution-based framework. And within this solution-based framework, I think there are two things that are really appealing. One is the work that you're doing with policymakers and really addressing the policy angle of it in terms of deplatforming, defunding, and going back to Anjum's point earlier in terms of holding our policymakers accountable. And the other is in terms of working with communities, various civil society organizations, bringing them together to build this space or infrastructure, if you will, that is going to be really vital in this challenging of this architecture of hate. So thank you so much, Harun, and look forward to our ongoing conversations. You want to add something, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think I just want to add something really quickly, that this understanding of what dangerous speech is really important to address some of Anjum's points. And one point she brought up was this Hindu phobia construct. The Hindu phobia construct, there's a very distinct pattern to it, right? People are accused of Hindu phobia and then subject to gross sexual slurs or violent, and are actually subject to violence, right? So this is a well-recognized neo-Nazi construct called accusation in the mirror. And if we knew that, we'd call it an accusation in the mirror, right? And we somehow so I think it's really important to recognize these constructs as Nazi constructs, because that helps us connect. And if there's one thing that I could leave with this is recognizing those constructs and taking a structured approach to recognizing these constructs as Nazi constructs, and that's something that really needs to be amplified, because I find it really troubling, the normalization of Hinduphobia, which is really a Nazi construct.
And again, that is such a powerful way to frame it, because you then have mainstream organizations that, for instance, here in Aotearoa are recognized by the Crown, have received funding in different forms from the Crown that use that narrative of Hinduphobia. So there is a real question to be asked there in terms of how are our policymakers, how are our national level policies actually then ending up sponsoring and catalyzing this kind of supremacist narratives, these kinds of communicative inversions, Kia ora. Thank you so much. If we have some time to take questions, it'll be great if we can bring everyone back onto the screen, and then we can have some discussion, maybe for about 10 minutes or so as we wrap up. So thank you all so much. I just want to open it up to you to see if any of you want to make any commentary and engage the others.
If I may, can I speak something about what Harun brought out, the Hindu phobia? I think very quickly, this has become a major weapon in the hands of, particularly for the Hindu diaspora, to silence the voices of criticism within the diaspora. It is becoming way of that there have been within the diaspora, there have been voices which shows that there are the problems with the Hinduism. I mean, we have been always arguing the casteism, the caste, particularly in the United States, it has become big, and also in Europe, and also down south. There have been this, so I think, in one way to stop it of this, but the other thing which is working for them, or they want to put these resources because to hide what is happening in India. So if you bring it as Harun were mentioning, it is one sense to silence the other critics within the diaspora, and also to justify what is happening in India, the kind of Muslim heads. So it's a very, very dangerous weapon, but it's a very powerful tool to justify what is going on. And I think the people, those who have been engaged, that have been the kind of threats coming. If you look at it, recently there was this the University of California, State University of California system, which brought out the caste as a way of, and look at the reactions by those so-called Hindu groups in the United States. I mean, if you see this, I mean, I'm one of their favorite targets, but I enjoy it. But that's a different thing. But but the people, if you don't know how to enjoy it, then you will get into it. I mean, you will silence. Who wants to use this mind for all these kind of people, and then being branded every morning, being anti-Hindu, anti-Indian? Why you want to be that? So better be silent. So I think that's a very powerful weapon to silence people.
So I think it's really important, Professor Swain, that we recognize that as Nazis, because that's what when the Nazis committed genocide on the Jews, they accused them of committing genocide on the Jews. When the Hutus committed genocide on the Tutsis, they did the same thing. And I think it's really important for academics and the civil society at large to recognize and call out Hinduphobia as a Nazi hate speech construct and nothing else. Because if we do that, then at least there is some deterrence in doing that. So we have actually written a paper. We'd love to share it with you, and that's something we'd be really keen to create greater awareness of. And it's based on academic constructs, of course, empirical evidence.
Yeah. Anshumi, we're going to talk a little bit about social media companies, and then Sapni wanted to talk about Hinduphobia and multiculturalism in Aotearoa.
Sorry, I always forget the mute. Yeah, I think, we've talked about responsibilities of government, but there's also a responsibility of private sector. And I know that, there are moves being made by social media companies and other online platforms. They want to deal with things like terrorist and violent extremist content online, but they're very hesitant to move into the area of hate material. And I think it is time that we kind of push them a bit more. I mean, the biggest push for me is they should pay their taxes in every country, but that's a separate matter. But it would fund actually a lot of the regulation that's needed. And one of the areas I've currently been writing a paper on is around algorithmic audits and having audits of the algorithms that are used to make material viral, that is used to make material go further and farther, And also, what controls are they putting to stop these fake accounts, to stop this kind of stuff? Because it's not just the tech fog. There, I've another article on Wired.in is an ex-Facebook person saying that this kind of stuff has been happening in Honduras, Azerbaijan, and I'm sure plenty of other countries. So we also need to think about regulation and holding tech platforms accountable and having this kind of transparency and accountability around what is happening on their platforms, because they do have a responsibility.
That's what a brilliant idea. Algorithmic audits, that just sounds so powerful. Sorry, Sapna, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to add to what Anjum was saying about particularly social media companies who look at India as this massive market where the economic benefits are outweigh the hate speech and the violence that is perpetuated within those platforms. I mean, the head of Twitter, when Jack resigned, is this Indian guy. I forget his name now. And these are questions we should be asking with, what is going on in Silicon Valley now that we know with caste discrimination. Obviously, there's also Islamophobia happening over there within those Indian circles, but it's not so well documented as the recent caste, that was legislated, the anti-caste discrimination that was legislated in California. Was that legislated, or was it just the universities? The caste discrimination. There was universities, right? In the state. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So so this is something that we should be questioning. I mean, Sundar Pichai is the boss of Google. So, these are Indian men, Savarna Hindu men who are leading these organizations, and what is their ideology? That is, how does that affect the culture of the organization? These are questions we should be asking. We should not be just looking at them as, oh, look, they're so successful, and this is the economic benefit that is happening. So that was just one thing. But I wanted to touch on what both Harun and Professor Swain said about Hindu phobia, particularly in relation to how multiculturalism is propagated, perpetuated, manifests in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's just still that singularity and the otherization, and therefore Hindu phobia fits very well within that context of, oh, it's not our problem. It's always the mainstream Pākehā or the white people, and how they consume the cultures of the ethnic communities, and that is the multiculturalism. And so Hindu phobia fits very well within that, because it is chucked out as this, these are people who are anti-Hindu, and nobody in the sort of the Western, Pākehā mainstream understand what that means. For them, it is just somebody who's being racist towards these people. And so that just becomes embedded in how they deal with these communities, and they're funded. I mean, there's a dance drama happening next month. Omicron. I don't know if Omicron will permit it, but which is funded by a government agency. And they did not question when I raised the question about how did they fund this organization, which is blatantly Islamophobic and anti-Hindu. Anti-Islamophobic and a Hindutva organization, and they did not even recognize that this could be a possibility. Because and if you raise that specter of Islamophobia, they immediately raise the specter of Hinduphobia. So it's just really complex. I'm just an observation. I don't know what the solution to this is, because we do not have the manpower to deal with that. That's what I feel. Yeah.
Can I just add a point there, Sapna? I mean, some of it may well be ignorance, but there's also complicity. I don't think we can write it all off to ignorance. There is a level of ignorance, but I am sure that there's a level of complicity there as well, both at the political level as well, because they see the numbers and the votes, they see the political donations, from a population that is reasonably well resourced in high positions and has a level of wealth. So I don't like the term because it's ableist, but that willful blindness, that choosing to not look,
Yeah.
is what is happening in some cases here.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when I saw your one particular name in your the slides that you showed about the Facebook group, who moves around in political circles, and is supported by ministers in parliament and praised by ministers in parliament, who has these interactions at grassroots level, which these same ministers will not recognize, because it recognizing that just muddies their work of getting votes from our communities, and it's better to, and that's how these things just happen, and we should be calling that out. And I mean, this year we have local elections, so I think this is a really great opportunity to jump in and question our councillors and the mayors, or whatever candidates, about what they think, how are they going to recognize this issue. It really at a grassroots level, this is what I feel, that this is an opportunity that we can take and question at local body elections.
Democracy of the grassroots,
Well, I think we just this, well, first of all, the people coming in who think it's just, I mean, you've seen the infiltration of the Democratic Party in the US by right-wing Hindus, and I mean, Biden just appointed Sonal Shah to a federal agent, some commission, and from what I'm reading, there's people who are going to be nominated to stand for whatever elections that are happening. They're Hindutva people, and this is exactly what is happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Both all political parties, except the Greens perhaps, but that'll happen as well at some point, I'm assuming, because this performative progressivism, as you want to, if I want to call it that, is just so easy to do. And I think the body elections, local body elections that we're having at the end of this year, is a really great opportunity for us to be questioning our potential representatives about what they think and their opinions. And we should really badger them. We should not just put it out in the media and ask these questions, but literally try and go for their Q&As and things like that, and ask them questions. This is the only way we can counter this idea of multiculturalism and the Hindu, the right-wing Hindu sort of ideology fitting within that multiculturalism. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm looking at the time, and I've looked through the Facebook window. There don't seem to be any questions. Balamohan, are there any questions?
No, not that I can see questions or comments, but something that I am noticing, which really touches on what some of you have presented, is how actually that the digital online space has its own sort of architecture that, there's bricks and mortars to it that includes bots. If some of you are watching on YouTube, you'll be noticing bots commenting, keeping track, and so on. So the idea that the digital is somehow disconnected, that fallacy can actually be interrogated when you see it working in this way.
Yes.
So thank you so much. I'm just giving a couple of moments if people want to have comments, but
Balamohan, there is a comment from Mahbubur that was on the screen. It says digital, and Mahbubur, thanks for joining from Bangladesh. He is in Bangladesh in Cox's Bazar in the Rohingya camps doing field work and joining us from there. So he says digital hate exists everywhere. Then what may be the solution, particularly in terms of role of politicians and role of academics? Any of you can take that.
Ooh.
I think you're on mute, Arunji.
So my view is that we call genocide a crime against humanity, and it is, right? And why do we need to wait for people to be exterminated before we call it a crime against humanity? We know that there's a direct correlation between dangerous speech and genocide. So we should be calling genocide a crime against humanity. And people who monetize, and this includes Facebook, I say that on a Facebook platform, if they're monetizing out of dangerous speech, they are committing a crime against humanity, and they should be subject to Magnitsky. And so I think we need to recognize, we need to define dangerous speech, and as a global community, recognize dangerous speech as a crime against humanity. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah. What I would say is, sorry, just very quickly, organize. That's what it is. You've got to organize. You've got to build the numbers. You've got to build support. That's the only way to have any political impact. If you don't organize, either you bring money or you bring people. That's what works in the political sphere. So, yeah.
I cannot say about thanks. Sapna, if you want to go, please go ahead. Okay.
I just said true, very true.
Okay, thank you. No, I mean, I think it is I can't talk about what the politicians do. That's their job. But what academics can do, I think there is a lot academics can do. The academics do need to first realize that not only in Bangladesh or in India or anywhere, we have a responsibility to the society. We need to carry out the responsibility. We need to raise our voices because there is in hesitation among the academics that not to go beyond what the academics points are or academics issues are. Maximum nowadays they're getting interested in some kind of policy matters, but that has been encouraged by the universities and also get some kind of consultancy money helps them. But there is a much larger issue. If the politics goes wrong, whatever the academics are doing, nothing matters. So unless the academics do really engage, then otherwise, because I think whatever you will see, wherever you will see, the authoritarian, for a democracy to survive, the campus needs to be politically active. The students needs to be politically aware and engaged. It's absolutely strange idea that we are trying to keep academics as well as the academic students out of the political realm, while the politics is and can really run the country and run the society or ruin the society. So in a sense, I think it's important that academics and students, particularly academic campuses, they need to be directly, actively politically engaged if the democracies can survive against the threat of this kind of ethno-nationalist forces.
That is so inspiring, and I think Ashok, in many ways, you lived that as a public scholar engaged in that conversation, and it's an inspiration for many of us in academia. We cannot do this without placing our bodies on the line in some way or the other, and recognizing that academic work is political work. So thank you.
There's a comment, I guess, in support of the idea that South Asians form a significant minority in Aotearoa New Zealand, and that our issues are to be discussed and made very present in our politics. So thank you for feeding that into this conversation space.
Sapna, you were going to add something?
This is a really great conversation, and it's given me some ideas about what to do next, particularly with in the activist space over here. Yeah, thank you, everybody. This is really stimulating.
Yeah. Thank you. It has been really pleasure interacting with all of you, and also I must congratulate Mohan for doing this. And I think, as I said in the beginning, this is the kind of work we all need to do because we have been stopped. I mean, there are many academics whom I know in India completely devastated. They want to do something, but of course they have to, they need to pay rent. They have to survive. The threats are huge. And so, of course, there are threats to us, but threats to all kinds of people outside. But it is important that we have certain kind of security. We do have certain kind of survival. And this is something we need to do, not only for ourselves, for the for the society, for the country, whatever the way you want to say it. But there is a larger responsibility we do have. And I think this is what I must congratulate. And I think it's thanks that we are doing this discussion. Go ahead with it.
Thank you, Professor. And for fine-tuning our moral compass with those words. And on behalf of CARE, on behalf of Professor Datta, I want to thank all of our respondents and presenters for joining us from Sweden, from Australia, and from the many places in Aotearoa. And I'd like to offer just a closing karakia to conclude our space, if I may. Kia tau ngā manaakitanga e te mea ngaro, ki runga ki tēnā o tātou, kia māhea te hua mā kihikihi, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori, kia tutura ka whakamaua kia tīna, haumie huie, tai kie. Go well, and from Tamaki Makaurau in my home, good night on behalf of CARE, and may you, I guess, with all of the learnings of today, have some inspiration and some call to continue this work ahead.
Thank you.